If you've used an operating system like DOS or Windows, you've probably come across terms like the A drive and the C drive and the D drive and the P drive and J and P and Z and the rest of them. And I'm sure you're probably even fairly confident as to what those designators actually mean. Well, DOS and Windows use letters like that, A colon, C colon and K colon, for example, to designate each available file system, also known as a partition, but I'm going to stick with the word file system. And a file system is a hierarchical structure of directories and files, and that's all. And as you can see on a given Windows computer, you can have several file systems. In other words, you can have several hierarchies of directories and files. Some of them might be your floppy disk. Then you've got your hard disk or disks, a CD-ROM drive or two perhaps, and you may even have network drives. Or, put another way, a file system that represents a directory structure on another hard disk somewhere else on the network. So we have typically one letter for each of them, and if you've got, say, 10 of them, 10 letters, then you have 10 separate file systems or 10 directory hierarchies. Well, it's different in Unix. There's always just one directory hierarchy. There's no such thing as an A drive and a C drive and a K drive and so forth. There's just the one file system. And its top level is just known as the root directory, or just / if you like. And yet, Unix is perfectly capable of running multiple file systems. In fact, most Unix systems do. So how does it work? How can we have multiple file systems when we've only got one directory hierarchy? Well, the solution is that we mount each available file system onto a subdirectory of the root file system. This means that we designate one of our file systems as, if you like, the master file system or the root file system. And then all the other file systems, if there are any, are, if you like, connected to the root file system. They're stuck on, glued on, if you like, to various directories. Each of these directories we call a mount point. We can use terms like connected or glued on or stuck on, but the technical term is they are mounted. And these file systems can include other hard disks. Your computer may have several hard disks in it, your floppy disks or CD-ROM drives and network drives. Each of these is connected to the root file system. I'll show you a diagram of that in a moment if the notion of connecting one file system to another is a bit fuzzy for you. What I should mention is that each connection point, each mount point, is just an empty subdirectory. There is a typical empty subdirectory used on all Unix systems, expressly for the purpose of having other file systems mounted onto it. That subdirectory is called /mnt, which of course is short for mount. But you don't have to mount your file systems into /mnt, you can mount them anywhere you like. You mount them into any subdirectory that you choose. Now, before we proceed, I should specify that typical users do not have the ability to mount file system. This is only typically able to be done by the system administrator, root, or anyone that root gives permission to do this to. Anyway, let's see what it looks like. Here's a very broad diagram of a typical Unix directory tree. Notice that the / directory is right at the top of the hierarchy, the root directory. And then we have 3 top-level directories, one called user, one called temp, and one called mount. And then under user we've got some other subdirectories. And now suppose we wish to mount another file system. And suppose also that we choose to do it into the /mnt directory. Well, then this is how it might look. You have another file system. That file system has its own root directory, and it may have some subdirectories as well, not to mention, of course, some files. And when you perform the mount command, what actually happens can be demonstrated as follows. The file system is essentially glued into place under the particular mount point that you specify. So, whereas before you connected the smaller file system You might have referred to one of its subdirectories in this example as, say, /source or /library. Once they are mounted under /mnt, they are now referred to as /mnt/source and /mnt/library. And all the users on the Unix system can be totally oblivious to the fact that all the files and subdirectories under /mnt/source or whatever have actually come from a completely separate hard disk, or perhaps even from a completely separate computer, in the case of a network drive. On a typical Unix computer you may find 5 or 6 or anything up to 20, perhaps, file systems mounted at various points on the file system. And nobody, except the system administrator, needs to pay particular attention to which directories are mounted and which ones are not. So you might think that you're accessing a file on one particular computer. You might think, well, I'm just accessing this file which is on the hard disk of that computer, when it's actually on a hard disk of a completely different computer, or it could even be on a CD-ROM drive or something else. There are ways to tell, of course, what file system you're working on and where that file system came from, and I'll show that to you now.